The latest EU summit, held in the heart of Brussels, concluded not with the decisive, headline-grabbing action many had hoped for, but with a sense of restrained caution that has become all too familiar in recent years. Instead of bold steps, the summit ended with a cautious compromise, as leaders weighed the risks and rewards of every move. The much-anticipated plan to seize and redirect billions in frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine was quietly shelved, despite months of intense negotiations and mounting pressure from both within and outside the bloc. In its place, EU leaders settled on a far more limited measure. Only the interest generated by these frozen assets, amounting to just a few billion euros each year, would be made available to Ukraine. This decision, reached after months of heated debate and diplomatic wrangling, represents a significant retreat from the aggressive measures that Washington and Kiev had been urging. Both the United States and Ukraine had lobbied hard for a more forceful approach, hoping to see Russia held directly accountable for the devastation in Ukraine. For Ukraine, the outcome is a sobering reality check. The interest payments, while helpful, are only a fraction of what's truly needed to rebuild shattered cities, restore critical infrastructure, and defend the country against ongoing aggression. The gap between what was promised and what was delivered is painfully clear. The original plan was widely seen as a form of justice, making Russia pay for the destruction it has caused. Its failure to materialize has left many Ukrainians and their supporters deeply disappointed, fueling protests and a sense of betrayal outside the summit halls. The debate inside the EU exposed deep and persistent divisions. On one side, some members argued passionately for moral action and solidarity with Ukraine. On the other, more cautious voices warned of the legal and financial risks involved in outright asset seizure. Risk-averse countries, especially those with strong financial sectors, cautioned that such a move could trigger legal chaos, undermine property rights, and damage the euro's reputation as a stable global currency. The fear of unintended consequences loomed large over the discussions. In the end, the outcome was a classic European compromise, prioritizing stability over boldness and consensus over confrontation. Leaders left the summit with a deal that satisfied no one completely, but avoided a damaging split. The EU's choice to embrace pragmatism over ambition will have lasting consequences, shaping not only Ukraine's future recovery, but also the European Union's credibility and influence on the global stage for years to come. Ukraine's war effort is running on empty. The country faces a massive budget deficit, with reconstruction costs nearing $500 billion. Daily destruction and economic collapse have left Ukraine dependent on Western aid for survival. The frozen Russian assets seemed a logical funding source, making the aggressor pay. But EU caution means only the interest will be used, not the principle. For Kyiv, this feels abstract compared to the daily reality of war. Western political fatigue and slow decision-making add to Ukraine's frustration. The failure to seize the assets puts pressure back on traditional, politically fraught aid. Ukraine remains in a precarious position, waiting for allies to act. After Russia's 2022 invasion, the West froze around 300 billion euros of Russian reserves, most of it in the EU. These assets, mainly held at Euroclear in Belgium, reflect deep pre-war financial ties. Unlike oligarch wealth, these are sovereign assets, protected by international law. Seizing them would break the principle of sovereign immunity, a legal cornerstone. That's why the EU immobilized, not confiscated the funds. The assets are blocked, but ownership hasn't changed. As bonds mature, the interest accumulates, and it's this windfall the EU will now use. The principle remains untouched, avoiding a legal minefield. This careful distinction is at the heart of the EU's cautious approach. The interest offers a small, steady revenue stream for Ukraine, without crossing a legal red line. The EU's refusal to seize Russia's principal assets is rooted in law and trust. International law protects state assets from seizure. Breaking this would set a dangerous precedent. Legal challenges from Russia could drag on for years, risking EU losses and global instability. Retaliation from Russia, legal or otherwise, would be swift. The euro's status as a global reserve currency depends on trust that assets are safe. Seizing Russian funds could trigger capital flight, weaken the euro, and damage EU influence. The European Central Bank warned that short-term gains would be outweighed by long-term harm. For many EU states, protecting legal norms and financial stability was non-negotiable. Belgium, home to Euroclear, was at the center of the asset debate. Any seizure would make Belgium, and Euroclear, the main target of Russian lawsuits. The legal and financial risks for Belgium were enormous, threatening its financial system and reputation. A crisis at Euroclear could ripple through global markets. Belgium's leaders insisted on protecting their institutions, not opposing aid to Ukraine. Their push for using only the interest, not the principle, shaped the EU's final compromise. For Belgium, the risks were immediate and existential, not just theoretical. Their caution became the EU's reality check. When outright seizure stalled, a new idea surfaced: the reparations loan. The plan was to use frozen Russian assets as collateral for a massive loan to Ukraine, repaid by future Russian reparations. If Russia defaulted, the assets could be seized. Proponents saw this as clever financial engineering, sidestepping legal barriers. But key EU members saw it as a delayed seizure, not a solution. The legal problems remain. Sovereign immunity wasn't solved, just postponed. The plan collapsed under legal and financial doubts. Belgium and others still faced the same risks. The reparations loan was too complex, too risky, and ultimately abandoned. With asset seizure and reparations loans off the table, the European Union found itself at a crossroads. The challenge of supporting Ukraine financially, without directly confiscating Russian assets or relying on traditional reparations, forced EU leaders to consider new collective solutions. In this moment of uncertainty, the EU turned to a powerful tool: joint debt. The European Commission, acting on behalf of all 27 member states, will now borrow money collectively on international markets. These funds will be distributed to Ukraine in the form of loans or grants, providing much-needed economic support as the war continues. This approach not only pools the financial strength of the entire bloc, but also demonstrates a united front in the face of crisis. This model of joint borrowing was first tested during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the EU issued common debt to fund recovery efforts. It marked a significant shift toward fiscal solidarity, showing that the EU could act as one in times of need. By issuing Eurobonds, the EU can raise large sums of money quickly and at lower interest rates, thanks to the collective creditworthiness of its members. This ensures that Ukraine receives stable, predictable support, even as the conflict drags on. However, the idea of joint debt remains controversial. Fiscally conservative countries, such as Germany and the Netherlands, worry about the risks of shared liabilities and the potential for moral hazard. They fear that mutualizing debt could encourage reckless spending by less disciplined members. Despite these concerns, what began as a temporary emergency measure is gradually becoming a standard response to crises. Each new round of joint borrowing sets a precedent, making it easier for the EU to act collectively in the future. With every instance of shared borrowing, the central institutions of the EU grow stronger, and the bonds between member states deepen. This process is slowly but surely driving greater integration across the continent. The war in Ukraine, much like the pandemic before it, is accelerating this federalizing trend. Both crises have shown that collective action is not just possible, but necessary for the EU to remain resilient and relevant on the world stage. Ironically, the inability to seize Russian assets has pushed the EU toward deeper unity. By embracing joint debt, the EU is forging a new path, one that could redefine its future as a more integrated and powerful union. The debate over frozen Russian assets is just the latest chapter in the European Union's long and complex story of crisis-driven integration. Throughout its history, the EU has often found itself at a crossroads where urgent challenges force member states to reconsider what it means to act together. Each new crisis tests the limits of unity, but also opens the door to new forms of cooperation and shared purpose. From the financial turmoil of the Greek debt crisis to the waves of migration that challenge borders, to the unprecedented health emergency of the COVID-19 pandemic, the EU has repeatedly muddled through uncertainty. Yet time and again, these moments of turmoil have sparked innovation, leading to new policies, institutions, and agreements that strengthen the Union. The ongoing debate over Ukraine fits this familiar pattern. At first, member states were divided, each weighing their own interests and concerns. But as the stakes grew clearer, the EU pivoted, moving from hesitation to a remarkable show of deeper cooperation and solidarity with Ukraine. One of the most striking examples is the embrace of joint debt. Once considered unthinkable, this approach has now become a repeatable model for tackling collective challenges, allowing the EU to pool resources and share risks in ways that were previously off limits. Of course, every step toward greater integration is met with resistance. National governments are often wary of ceding too much power, fiercely guarding their sovereignty and the interests of their citizens. Debates in parliaments and protests on the streets reflect these ongoing tensions. The controversy over Russian assets has brought these divisions into sharp focus. Yet, it has also highlighted the EU's unique ability to find compromise, balancing national interests with the need for collective action, and ultimately, forging agreements that move the project forward. The war in Ukraine has been a turning point, forcing the EU to step up as a true geopolitical power. No longer just a trade bloc, the Union is now grappling with questions of defense, security, and its role on the world stage. Today, financial decisions are inseparable from defense and foreign policy. The EU is learning that economic strength, strategic autonomy, and security are all deeply interconnected, requiring a more unified approach than ever before. By funding Ukraine through collective borrowing, the EU is not just supporting a neighbor in need, it is building the financial and political muscle needed for a stronger, more influential global role. Once again, crisis is acting as the engine of integration, forging a more united and resilient European Union, one that is better equipped to face the challenges of an uncertain world. As of December 2025, the EU stands at a crossroads. Using only the interest from Russian assets offers modest support for Ukraine, but leaves big funding questions. The focus now shifts to joint debt, a test of EU unity and political will. Ukraine fatigue and internal divisions threaten future aid. The EU must convince its citizens that supporting Ukraine is vital for Europe's own security. Globally, the EU must defend its actions and the Euro's credibility amid Russian disinformation. The frozen assets saga shows the EU's struggle to turn economic power into decisive action. The pivot to joint debt is not failure, but a strategic shift, one that will define both Ukraine's fate and the EU's future.